The morning of August 9th, 1945, broke gray and silent over the hills outside Shenyang, Manchuria. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of hell breath, the kind that settles over a landscape just before everything changes. Sergeant Roy Matsumoto crouched low behind a curtain of brushwood, his body perfectly still, his breathing measured. Around him, the jungle and scrubland of occupied Manchuria stretched in every direction, indifferent to men moving through it. He had been behind Japanese lines for 3 days. No radio contact, no backup, no visible route home. In his hand, a folded document issued by an American intelligence command bore a single operational instruction that, to any rational soldier, would have sounded like a death sentence. Locate the Japanese garrison command post east of Shenyang. Assess strength and positioning. Return with prisoners for interrogation. Return with prisoners. Not escape, if possible. Not observe and withdraw. Return with prisoners. Plural. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What made this order almost incomprehensible wasn't the danger of the mission itself. War in 1945 was saturated with danger. What made it incomprehensible was the man they had sent to carry it out. Roy Matsumoto was Japanese-American, born in Los Angeles, raised partly in Japan, fluent in the language and customs of the very army hunting him. In the eyes of Imperial Japanese military intelligence, a man like Matsumoto was the most wanted category of enemy imaginable, not merely a soldier to be killed, but a traitor to be captured, interrogated, and made an example of. The standing order from Japanese command for Nisei's soldiers caught behind their lines was explicit. They were not to be treated as prisoners of war. And yet here he was, moving through the Manchurian brush toward a fortified Japanese position, armed with a pistol, a handful of grenades, and something far more unusual, the ability to think, speak, and reason like the men he was hunting. To understand how Roy Matsumoto arrived at this particular hillside on this particular morning, you have to go back further, not to the war itself, but to a childhood split across two worlds in a way that most Americans in 1945 would have found deeply unsettling. Matsumoto was born in Los Angeles in 1913, the son of Japanese immigrants who had come to California in the early years of the century. His family, like thousands of other Issei and Nisei families along the Pacific coast, occupied a complicated social position. They were Americans by birth or naturalization, embedded in the rhythms of California life, running small businesses, sending children to American schools. But they were also Japanese in culture, language, and family memory in ways that made their neighbors regard them with an unease that would curdle into something far uglier after December 7th, 1941. As a young man, Matsumoto had spent several years living in Japan, staying with relatives, attending Japanese schools, absorbing not just the formal language of newspapers and official correspondence, but the texture of everyday Japanese speech, the idioms, the honorifics, the way a junior soldier addressed a commanding officer, the precise verbal formulas that carried enormous weight in a military culture built on hierarchy and ritual. He returned to the United States in his 20s, worked in California, and was building an ordinary American life when Pearl Harbor detonated everything. The weeks following Pearl Harbor were among the most disorienting in American domestic history for Japanese-American communities. Overnight, men and women who had lived in the United States for decades, whose children had grown up speaking English, found themselves treated as enemy agents. Neighbors who had waved good morning across driveways for years now watched them with open suspicion. The FBI began arresting community leaders within hours of the attack. And then, in February of 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the forced relocation of all persons of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast. Over 110,000 people were removed from their homes. Businesses, farms, and property accumulated over lifetimes were sold at fractions of their value or simply abandoned. Families were given days to pack what they could carry. They were transported to internment camps in the interior, places like Manzanar in the California desert, Topaz in Utah, Minidoka in Idaho, places surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, built on the logic that ancestry alone constituted a security threat. What daily life inside these camps actually looked like is worth pausing on, because it shaped the men who would eventually be recruited out of them. The camps were not death camps in the European sense. People were fed, housed in tar paper barracks, given access to schools and medical care. But they were prisons nonetheless. Families of 4 and 5 were assigned to single rooms measuring 20 by 25 feet. Communal latrines offered no privacy. Dust storms in the desert camps coated everything, food included. Parents who had built modest prosperity over decades watched their children do homework in overcrowded rooms while guards with rifles patrolled the perimeter fence outside. The psychic damage of being imprisoned by the country you considered your own on the basis of your face and your ancestry, and nothing else, was not something that an adequate barracks or functioning mess hall could repair. Roy Matsumoto was among those interned. The cruelty of what happened next is one of the quiet, enduring ironies of the entire American war effort. The United States government was simultaneously imprisoning Japanese-American men for being potentially disloyal and desperately searching for Japanese-American men who could serve as military intelligence assets because the Army had a catastrophic problem. Almost no one in the United States military could read, speak, or interpret Japanese at a functional operational level. Before the war, military planners had given almost no thought to Japanese language capability. The assumption, rooted in the same racial hierarchy that would produce the internment camps, was that Japan was not a serious long-term adversary. When that assumption collapsed on the morning of December 7, 1941, the Army found itself staring at captured documents, intercepted radio transmissions, and interrogation situations for which it had almost no qualified personnel whatsoever. The solution they arrived at was, depending on how you looked at it, either pragmatic or deeply shameful. The Army would recruit Japanese-American men, many of them directly out of internment camps, and train them as military intelligence specialists. The Military Intelligence Service Language School, originally established at the Presidio in San Francisco and later relocated to Camp Savage in Minnesota, began training Nisei linguists for deployment across the Pacific Theater. The men who volunteered faced a particular kind of psychological weight that their white counterparts did not. They were being asked to serve a country that had imprisoned their families. Their parents remained behind barbed wire while they trained for combat. Some recruits received letters from siblings describing conditions in the camps while they studied military terminology in Minnesota. The government asked them to be loyal to an America that had explicitly declared them suspect. Most of them went anyway. Their reasons were complex and personal. Some wanted to prove a point, to demonstrate through service what documents and speeches could not. Some went because they believed, despite everything, in the country where they had been born. Some went because refusal would have made things worse for families still in the camps. And some went quietly and practically because the Army was the only institution currently offering them a way out. Matsumoto volunteered. He was accepted into the Military Intelligence Service and trained as an interpreter and field intelligence operative. His language ability was assessed as exceptional, not merely conversational but culturally fluent, capable of the kind of register shifting that operational intelligence required. Telling a frightened Japanese private that cooperation was his best option required a completely different vocabulary and tone than intercepting a command communication. Matsumoto could do both. By the time he completed training, the Pacific War had already reshaped itself dramatically from the naval and amphibious campaigns of its early years. The island-hopping strategy was grinding toward Japan itself, and American commanders were increasingly focused on a threat that would define the final phase of the war. On the Asian continent, the Imperial Japanese Guandong Army occupied Manchuria, the vast northeastern region of China that Japan had seized in 1931. The Guandong Army at its peak had been the most powerful and battle-hardened formation in the Japanese military, the elite institution that had shaped Japanese military doctrine and trained a generation of officers. By 1945, it had been substantially stripped of its best units to feed the grinding attrition of the Pacific Islands, but remained a formidable force, estimated at somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million men, dug into a network of fortifications, command posts, and supply depots across a territory larger than Western Europe. American strategic planners knew that understanding the Guangdong Army's actual strength, disposition, and state of readiness was going to be essential, particularly given that Soviet entry into the Pacific War, promised at Yalta in February 1945, would require coordinated intelligence on Japanese positions in Manchuria. The problem was getting that intelligence. Aerial reconnaissance could map positions but could not assess morale, supply levels, or the internal communications that reveal command intentions. What was needed was human intelligence. Eyes and ears inside Japanese-held territory. Eyes and ears that could pass as Japanese. The Military Intelligence Service had been deploying Nisei operatives in smaller roles across the Pacific for years by this point, largely in interrogation and document translation capacities. Their contributions had been staggering and largely invisible. Nisei linguists had translated captured Japanese operational orders at Midway that gave American commanders critical forewarning. They had interrogated prisoners after Guadalcanal whose testimony revealed Japanese supply vulnerabilities. They had decoded documents taken at Buna and New Guinea that exposed entire Japanese order of battle structures. General Douglas MacArthur's intelligence chief, Brigadier General Charles Willoughby, would later estimate that Nisei linguists had shortened the Pacific War by 2 years. But this particular mission was different in character from translation work or prisoner interrogation at established American positions. Matsumoto was being asked to move independently through territory where every person he encountered was a potential threat, where his face fit, but his uniform did not, where the very language skills that made him valuable also meant that Japanese soldiers who caught him would know exactly what he was. He moved through the Manchurian landscape with the practiced patience of a man who understood that speed was the enemy of survival in situations like this. The terrain around Shenyang in August was dense with late summer growth, the brushland thick enough to provide cover, but open enough in places to leave a moving man exposed at distances that made rifle fire viable. He had memorized the approach routes from aerial photographs. He had studied garrison patrol schedules derived from earlier intelligence reports. He knew, in the abstract, where he was going. The question was what would be waiting when he got there. The Japanese garrison, he was tasked with assessing, occupied a cluster of administrative buildings on the eastern edge of a small settlement, the kind of semi-permanent installation that the Guangdong Army had established across Manchuria during 14 years of occupation. These were not the desperate cave defenses of Saipan or the jungle redoubts of New Guinea. This was an occupation army in its administrative heartland, and that distinction mattered enormously for what Matsumoto was about to attempt. An occupation army is, by nature, both more comfortable and more complacent than a frontline combat force. The garrison soldiers around Shenyang, in the summer of 1945, had not faced direct combat in months, or in some cases years. Their daily rhythms were structured around administrative duties, perimeter checks conducted with the mechanical regularity of habit rather than the sharp alertness of men who expected contact. Their officers were managing logistics and paperwork as much as they were preparing for battle, but they were not entirely at ease. Because August 9, 1945, was not an ordinary morning in Manchuria. The previous day, August 8th, the Soviet Union had declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion across the Manchurian border with a force of 1.5 million men, 11,000 tanks and artillery pieces, and over 4,000 aircraft. The Soviet offensive, codenamed Operation August Storm, had struck the Guangdong Army with catastrophic force along a front stretching nearly 3,000 miles. The carefully prepared Japanese border defenses had been overwhelmed within hours. Soviet armored columns were already driving deep into Manchurian territory. The garrison near Shenyang knew that something enormous was happening. Radio communications were fragmentary and often contradictory. Officers were issuing and countermanding orders with the frantic energy of men trying to respond to a situation that was changing faster than their understanding of it. Soldiers who had spent months in the sedative routine of occupation duty were being told to prepare for combat operations without being told clearly against whom or for which direction the threat was coming. It was into this atmosphere of controlled panic and fractured command that Roy Matsumoto now moved. He had been observing the garrison perimeter for the better part of 2 hours when he identified the opening he needed, A patrol of 4 soldiers had departed the main compound and was moving along a scrub-line track that curved away from the settlement toward a low ridgeline used, according to his intelligence briefing, as a secondary observation post. The patrol spacing was loose, their attention directed outward toward the horizon rather than toward the brush on either side of them. They were looking for Soviet armor, not for a single man crouched 10 meters from their path. What Matsumoto noticed, watching them, was a detail that casual observation would have missed. The patrol was not moving with the coordinated alertness of men on active combat footing. They were moving the way soldiers move when they have been told to be cautious without being told specifically what to be cautious about. Their eyes swept the horizon in the unfocused way of men performing a task whose urgency they understood intellectually but had not yet felt in their bodies. The uncertainty running through the entire garrison that morning had reached this patrol as well. They were soldiers caught between the training that told them what to do in known situations and a situation that was not yet fully known. Matsumoto made his calculation quickly, the way men do when circumstances compress the available time for deliberation. For soldiers was too many to handle by himself if they all responded simultaneously and rationally. But soldiers under sudden, unexpected, psychologically disorienting pressure frequently did not respond simultaneously and rationally. They responded in fragments. They looked to each other for cues. They hesitated for the fraction of a second it took to process the unexpected. That fraction of a second was what Matsumoto was counting on. He waited until the patrol had passed his position, and then rose from the brush behind them. He spoke in Japanese, crisply and with command authority. Not the panic bark of a man in danger, but the flat, carrying tone of an officer who expected immediate compliance. The patrol froze. What happened in the next several minutes on that Manchurian track was something that conventional military training did not cover, because it operated entirely in the psychological space between what soldiers expected and what was actually happening in front of them. The patrol had expected, if they encountered an enemy, to encounter someone who could not speak to them in their own language. The standing mental architecture of their training assumed an adversary who communicated through force. What they encountered instead was a man speaking to them in perfectly inflected Japanese, telling them in terms they understood immediately that the situation around them was not what they believed it to be. Matsumoto told them the garrison was already surrounded. He told them the Soviet advance had cut off all routes of withdrawal. He told them that their commanding officer had already been taken into custody and had provided information about the garrison's positions. He told them that the soldiers who cooperated now would be separated from those who did not, and that the distinction would matter for what came next. Some of these statements were true. The Soviet advance had indeed rendered most Guangdong army positions strategically isolated. The broader military situation was exactly as dire as Matsumoto described it. The specific claim about their commanding officer was not true, but it was plausible in a way that a more outlandish lie would not have been, because the garrison had been receiving fragmentary communications all morning suggesting that command structures were collapsing at multiple levels. The oldest soldier in the patrol, a corporal by the insignia on his collar, held his rifle at a neutral angle and stared at Matsumoto for a long moment. The calculation visible in his face was one that any soldier in any army across any war would have recognized. The math of survival. What the corporal was looking at did not fit any category he had been trained to handle. And in the gap between his training and his reality, Matsumoto's voice filled the space with the only coherent narrative available. Weapons came down. First one, then, in the sequence that almost always follows once the first soldier breaks, the others. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 4 Japanese soldiers stood in the Manchurian scrubland with their hands raised. Matsumoto had his prisoners. But the mission was not complete, because 4 prisoners taken from a patrol on the garrison perimeter would tell American intelligence something, but not everything that was needed. What the Army needed was someone with direct knowledge of garrison strength, supply levels, and command intentions. What they needed was an officer, and getting an officer meant going closer to the compound. Matsumoto secured the 4 prisoners as best he could, which is to say he had them sit, watch them carefully, and calculated whether any of them was likely to make a decision that would end the mission. The corporal was a variable. He was older than the others, experienced enough to think tactically, and Matsumoto could see him reading the situation with the careful attention of a man who had not survived this long by acting impulsively. Matsumoto spoke to him directly, told him that cooperation was already a decision made and that reversing it now served no one. He told him that the men back at the garrison needed to know what the actual situation was, that the picture they were being given through fragmentary radio communications was not the true picture, and that accurate information was the only thing that could still save lives. This was partly a manipulation and partly the truth, and the combination was more effective than either alone would have been. The corporal nodded slowly. He understood something that his training had not prepared him to understand, which was that the war he had been told he was fighting bore diminishing resemblance to the war that was actually happening around him. What Matsumoto did next was the kind of decision that happens faster than it can be reasoned through, because the reasoning, if done fully, would have arrived at a conclusion that made it impossible. He told the corporal that he was going to approach the garrison command post, that the corporal was going to accompany him, that the corporal's presence, his uniform, his rank, his face, would provide the 10 seconds of assumption and hesitation that Matsumoto needed to reach the officer he was there to find. The corporal looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood up. They moved toward the garrison together in the thin morning light. A Japanese corporal and a man in American military clothing who spoke to him in Japanese as they walked, quietly, about what was going to happen and what the corporal needed to do and not do. Around them, Manchuria continued its vast indifference to the small catastrophes unfolding across its surface. The garrison's outer perimeter was a low fence line with 2 guards at the main track entrance. Both guards saw the corporal first, which was a point. The corporal was familiar. The corporal was one of them. The guards' eyes moved to Matsumoto second, and in that second the question forming in their minds was not yet a shout or a raised weapon. It was still a question. That question was what Matsumoto spoke into. He told them there was a situation requiring the immediate attention of the duty officer. He used a specific Japanese military compound noun for a security situation requiring command assessment, a phrase specific enough to register as authentic, serious enough to generate urgency. One of the guards turned toward the compound. The other stayed, uncertain, his hand near his rifle but not on it. The duty officer appeared at the entrance of the main building 2 minutes later, buttoning his collar as he came. A lieutenant, young, with the haggard look of a man who had been receiving bad news all morning and expected to receive more. He saw the corporal, and then he saw Matsumoto, and his face went through a complete sequence: recognition, confusion, alarm, in the time it takes to draw a breath. Matsumoto did not give him the time to complete the alarm. He spoke quickly, precisely, without raising his voice, because raised voices invite raised voices in response. He told the lieutenant his rank, his unit designation as an American military intelligence officer, and the fact that he was there under the authority of the combined Allied command now coordinating the encirclement of Manchurian Japanese positions. He told the lieutenant that the garrison situation, strategically, was already resolved, that the question remaining was only how many of the men inside that compound would walk away from it. He told him that he had 4 of his soldiers outside the perimeter who had already made that choice and were unharmed. The lieutenant's eyes went to Corporal. The corporal, without prompting, confirmed what Matsumoto had said, that the soldiers outside were unharmed, that the situation was as described. There was a moment of absolute stillness in the garrison entrance, the kind of stillness that precedes either violence or decision in roughly equal measure. Matsumoto held it, because breaking it in the wrong direction would end everything. What he understood in that moment, and what no training manual could have taught him, was a specific quality of the lieutenant's hesitation. It was not the hesitation of a man who believed he could fight his way out of the situation. It was a hesitation of a man who was being given permission to do something he already wanted to do, but had not yet found a framework for. The lieutenant had been awake since before dawn, receiving reports that contradicted each other and instructions from superiors who were themselves receiving contradictory instructions from above. He was a young officer in the administrative backwater of an army whose strategic situation had collapsed overnight, and someone was now standing in front of him speaking his language and offering the one thing that the fragmenting communication network around him could not provide: clarity. That was what Matsumoto was selling, more than survival. Clarity, a coherent account of what was happening and what it meant and what the available choices actually were. In the chaos of that morning, that was worth more than almost anything else. Then the lieutenant asked, in a voice that had lost most of its command register and become something smaller and more honest, what would happen to his men. And Matsumoto told him, medical treatment for the wounded, food and water, treatment in accordance with the laws of war. The prospect of surviving the end of a war that, on this morning of August 9th, 1945, everyone in that garrison already knew in some part of themselves was over. The lieutenant stood for a moment longer. Around them, the sounds of the garrison continued, men moving inside the compound, a radio crackling with unintelligible fragments. Somewhere distant, the deep concussion of Soviet artillery reshaping the Manchurian horizon. Then the lieutenant turned back toward the compound and gave an order. What emerged from that garrison in the following hour was not the lightning capitulation of a broken unit. It was something more complicated and more human. Soldiers came out in small groups, some looking at Matsumoto with open curiosity, some avoiding his eyes entirely. Several NCOs had to be spoken to individually by the lieutenant before they would move. 2 soldiers were found to have concealed weapons that had to be surrendered before they would join the others. 1 man wept quietly as he crossed the perimeter line, and nobody around him, American or Japanese, acknowledged it. By the time the count was complete, Roy Matsumoto had brought in 40 Japanese soldiers from that garrison, including the duty lieutenant who had become, in the space of a single morning, both his prisoner and one of the instruments of his mission's success. 40 prisoners. 1 man. No shots fired. The story of what happened when Matsumoto got those 40 prisoners back to American lines reveals something that the official record handles with characteristic military understatement. His commanding officer, upon receiving the prisoners and debriefing Matsumoto, reportedly had difficulty processing the simplest version of events. The mission had called for prisoner acquisition for intelligence purposes. Matsumoto had accomplished the mission. The fact that he had accomplished it by walking into a Japanese garrison and talking his way out with 40 men in tow was, apparently, a detail that required some additional documentation. The intelligence value of those 40 prisoners was considerable. Among them were soldiers who could speak to garrison strength at multiple points along the Shenyang perimeter, to supply levels that had been severely degraded by the disruption of rail lines, and to the state of command communications that confirmed what aerial intelligence had suggested. The Guangdong Army in the Shenyang region was not preparing an organized resistance. It was experiencing progressive dissolution that happens to a large military organization when the premises on which its existence was built collapse faster than new premises can be constructed. But the intelligence value, real as it was not the most significant thing Roy Matsumoto brought back from that hillside. The most significant thing was something harder to file in a report or mark on a map. He brought back proof of a principle that the United States military had been institutionally resistant to accepting, which was that the men fighting for Japan were not, in any meaningful sense, different from the men fighting against it. They were subject to the same fears and calculations and fundamental desire to survive that governed every human being in extreme circumstances. What they lacked, in the summer of 1945, was a coherent narrative that made survival possible. The story they'd been given by their officers and their state said that surrender was death, that the enemy would torture and execute them, that dying in place was the only honorable option. Matsumoto, in Japanese, with a cultural fluency to make the alternative narrative credible, had offered them a different story, and enough of them had chosen to believe it that 40 men who might otherwise have died on a Manchurian hillside were alive in American custody 3 hours later. The broader context of August 1945 makes Matsumoto's mission feel, in retrospect, like one of the last chapters of a story that was already concluding. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima had occurred 3 days earlier on August 6th. The Soviet declaration of war and the Manchurian invasion had begun the previous day, on August 9th. The same morning Matsumoto was moving toward the Shenyang garrison, a second atomic bomb was falling on Nagasaki. Japan's Emperor Hirohito would announce the decision to surrender on August 15th. The formal surrender documents would be signed aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945. The Guandong Army's collapse, which happened with startling rapidity once Soviet forces drove deep into Manchuria, resulted in the capture of approximately 590,000 Japanese soldiers who became Soviet prisoners of war, many of whom would spend years in Siberian labor camps before being repatriated. The men Matsumoto had taken into American custody would fare considerably better. For Roy Matsumoto personally, the end of the war brought a return to an America that was not yet ready to reckon honestly with what it asked of men like him. He had served in the Military Intelligence Service, an organization whose existence and contributions were classified for decades after the war. The men who had shortened the Pacific conflict through intelligence work, who had translated the documents and interrogated the prisoners and walked into enemy territory in ways that no training manual quite covered, would not receive formal recognition for their service until long after the moment had passed when that recognition would have meant the most. The Military Intelligence Service Language School veterans were not invited to victory parades. Their service records contained classification markings that prevented them from fully explaining what they had done even to family members. The Nisei soldiers who returned from Europe with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the most decorated unit of its size in American military history, came home to find that their families were still behind barbed wire in some cases, or had returned to find their homes and businesses gone. The government had asked everything of these men and offered, in return, a classification stamp and a discharge paper. The irony that men whose families had been imprisoned for suspected disloyalty had provided some of the most significant intelligence contributions of the entire war was not a subject that post-war American commemoration found comfortable to address. It complicated the clean narrative of a righteous war fought by a united nation. It asked questions that the country preferred, for several decades, not to hear. Matsumoto returned to civilian life in the late 1940s. He was, by any account, a quiet and self-contained man. He had grown up in the space between two cultures and had found, during the war, that this in-between position was the most tactically valuable ground available to him. In peacetime, that same position could feel like belonging nowhere entirely. He would eventually receive recognition for his service, though the process took the kind of time that makes recognition feel more like historical correction than genuine honor. The Military Intelligence Service was declassified in the 1970s. The contributions of Nisei soldiers were documented by historians who understood that an enormous chapter of American military history had been systematically omitted from the official account. Monuments were erected. Citations were issued. President George W. Bush awarded the Congressional Gold Medal in 2010 to veterans of the 102nd Infantry Battalion and 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and later to the Military Intelligence Service veterans. Roy Matsumoto was among those honored. He lived to receive it, which was more than some of his contemporaries managed. He passed away in 2014 at the age of 100, a century of life that it contained, somewhere near its middle, a morning in Manchuria, when he had walked toward men who were ordered to capture or kill him, and had come back with 40 of them. The Japanese soldiers who surrendered to Matsumoto that morning were never asked, in any record that survived, what they thought about what had happened to them. History rarely asks the surrender for their account. What can be said with confidence is that the corporal, the one who had held his rifle at a neutral angle and completed the calculation in his own mind before lowering it, had made a decision that the military culture he had been raised in did not have a comfortable category for. He had chosen, in the moment when it mattered, the thing that was true over the thing he had been told. There is a detail in Matsumoto's mission that the summary accounts tend to compress past the point of visibility. 10 seconds. The fraction of time between the moment a garrison guard sees someone unexpected and the moment he decides what to do about it. Matsumoto had built his entire approach around those seconds. Every element of his preparation, his language, his tone, his choice of which approach to use, the corporal walking beside him, the specific military vocabulary he deployed at the compound entrance, was designed to fill those seconds with something that pointed toward compliance rather than resistance. He had studied, essentially, the architecture of hesitation, the way certainty collapses when circumstances present something that training did not cover, the way soldiers look to each other for cues in the moment before a decision crystallizes, the way a single authoritative voice in the right language can redirect a group of men who have not yet committed to any course of action. This is not a skill the Army teaches, or taught in 1945. It is not something that appears in field manuals or training curricula. It lived in Roy Matsumoto specifically because of where he'd grown up, the family that had shaped him, the years of Japanese schooling, the summers absorbing a culture that was simultaneously his heritage and the heritage of the men he was being sent to fight against. He carried something into that Manchurian hillside that no amount of military training could have placed there, and what he carried was the reason 40 men came back alive. The story of Roy Matsumoto is, among other things, a story about what America threw away when it imprisoned its Japanese-American communities in 1942. The families of every Nisei soldier who had trained at Camp Savage, the entire network of cultural knowledge and linguistic fluency that represented, had the country been willing to see it, one of its most significant strategic assets. That asset was nearly discarded entirely, locked behind barbed wire along with the people who carried it, treated as a liability rather than a resource, a threat rather than a strength. Some of those same people then volunteered to go and fight for the country that had imprisoned their families. They brought back intelligence that shortened a war. They walked into enemy territory and came out with prisoners. They did things that the conventional military apparatus could not do and would not have done, and then returned to a country that spent the next 30 years classifying their service and omitting their names from the accounts it told about itself. August 9th, 1945. The morning Roy Matsumoto walked toward 40 Japanese soldiers who had been ordered to capture or kill him. The morning he came back with all of them. In the frozen arithmetic of a war that measured everything in casualties, it seems like a small accounting. 40 men, one mission, no shots fired. But the number is not really the point. The point is the 10 seconds, the hesitation, the moment when a garrison guard looked at something that did not fit his training, and a voice spoke into Gap in a language he understood, and he made a choice. That choice happened because Roy Matsumoto had been raised, partly, in Japan, because he carried a language and a cultural fluency that his country had tried to treat as a liability, because he walked into a situation where everything that had been done to him and his community had become, in that specific moment, the only thing that could have worked. He brought back 40 prisoners. He came back himself. The men he captured were fed and treated according to the laws of war, as he had promised they would be. He had told them the truth. That was the thing about Matsumoto that the Japanese corporal had apparently recognized. Standing in the Manchurian scrubland with his rifle at a neutral angle and his future narrowing to a single decision. The man speaking to him in Japanese was telling the truth. That was enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.